Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Part 4, Psychological Warfare After World War II. Chapter 14, The Cold War and Seven Small Wars.
The period after 1945 has turned out to be considerably more turbulent than most Americans expected. Though the victory over fascism and Japanese militarism has proved to be psychologically and historically complete, the struggles between the victors have developed such mistrust and bitterness as to create a present-day equivalent of the 30 Years' War, rather than a period of peace as it was understood by educated men of the 19th century. Along with many other military and political phenomena, psychological warfare has been thrust into a period of no war and no peace, which has proved to be extraordinarily difficult for Western men to deal with, either emotionally or intellectually. Such phrases as Churchill's term, the Iron Curtain, and Walter Lippmann's coinage, the Cold War, have become a part of civilized speech throughout the world. They have obscured almost as much as they have explained. It is entirely conceivable that an adequate description of the present historical period will only be written after the forces now operating have ceased to be significant. At that future time, it may be possible for serious and reflective men to determine what happened in the middle of the 20th century. Recognition and delay. One of the preeminent factors in the psychological and opinion aspect of the turmoil in the mid-20th century has been the very sharp contrast between the time on which a given event occurred, the delay between the occurrence of the event, and the final understanding of that event, in their own terms, by the strategic policymakers affected, and the successful recognition of the event in policy papers looking toward a further future. The political and strategic character of much recent military history has therefore been a grotesque comedy of errors, ridiculous if it were not so deadly serious, involving the lives of the major urban populations of the world. An event such as the liberation of Indochina from Japanese military occupation in 1945, met competently and reasonably by the standards of an anticipated world of 1946, which unfortunately never materialized, led to the frustrations, bloodshed, deceit, and warfare of the late 1940s, and by 1954 became partially intelligible as a facet of the free world's struggle against communism. New interpretations of policy and propaganda. Polemic writing has been done concerning the role of propaganda, psychological warfare, psychological strategy, and comparable operations. In many instances, the polemics have involved the presentation of two sides, each of which was right one side, maintaining that the old-fashioned world of free, sovereign nations, meeting in a parliament of man as constituted in the United Nations, could and should use the realities of traditional power politics as a guide to the present and the future, and should avoid the hopelessness, terrorism, and fanaticism of chronic ideological war. The other side, with equal merits, has often argued that the ideological war is here, that its deniers are the witting or unwitting sympathizers or appeasers of communism, that their realities are outmoded, and that the United States must face up to a crusade which will end in annihilation or death for either the communist system or the constitutional democratic group of states. What such polemics overlook is the terrifying probability that events may happen so rapidly that no one on either the communist or anti-communist side is capable of assimilating a new datum, such as the development of the hydrogen bomb, the death of Stalin, or the appearance of Israel among the nations, until well after the event has occurred. The occurrence of public events in all past civilizations has involved a considerable number of public agreements on the major hypotheses concerned. As pointed out earlier in this book, the antagonists in older wars usually, though not always, knew what the war was about. Today, the spiritual, psychological, logical, and scientific inconsistencies and paradoxes within each system are so deep as to make the definition of long-range goals almost impossible. Any one goal, such as the establishment of peace, the appreciation of an international system of alliances against aggression, the maintenance of national sovereignty, the protection of a free enterprise economy, the assurance of self-determination to non-self-governing peoples, or the like, may, if emphasized, contradict the concomitant goals which support it. Communist and anti-communist psychological events. Each of the two major systems has strengths of its own. The communist strengths are sometimes too apparent to Americans, so much so that Americans exaggerate communist power and overlook serious deficiencies in the economies and the political character of the communist group of nations. The communists can suppress dissidents with a fanatical party line. The price they pay is the abrupt shifting of that line as international situations change. The communists can appeal to youth by their dogmatic faith that they are the masters of the probable future of the world. They risk much if this faith does not pay off, and if the world's youth sometimes turns against them because they promise too much and deliver too little. The communists operating from an allegedly material basis offer psychological and spiritual values of a perverted kind, but have very considerable propaganda value. They give people a chance to sacrifice themselves, to work for causes greater than their individual personalities, something to die for, and an apparent understanding of history. Yet the communists also risk psychological exhaustion and cynicism among their elite cadres as well as among their mass followings. In the next chapter, concerning strategic information operations of the United States government in the foreign field, there will be further discussion of the psychological strengths of the free world. We will say at this point that in the light of the strategic and military contexts of the post-war period, the free world has had the advantages of modesty, relaxation, and elasticity. Among Americans, even among intelligent Americans, it is frequent to find the assumption being made that the chief strength of the free world consists of its legal rights and its democratic political processes, rather than in its actual, not merely formal, toleration of many points of view and its actual relaxation of the populations under its control. Since the free world is not committed to victory as much as is the communist world, it can afford more defeats without a corresponding loss of morale. Since the free world has not promised a utopian future, it can go from the reality of the 1950s to whatever realities the 1960s or the 1970s may bring, without a sharp letdown in morale or widespread heartbreak among its most gifted advocates. In Cold War terms, the free world is committed to fighting, but not to victory, while the communists are committed to the actual, though remote, promise of triumph for their system throughout the world. The citizens of the United States can therefore contemplate the survival of the USSR or its annihilation and replacement by a democratic Russia with equanimity. Their Soviet opposite numbers, group for group and class for class, cannot be as detached from the struggle. Over all of us there hangs the entirely uncertain future raised by possible use of atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, and other novel weapons, a future about which former Governor Adlai Stevenson felt so gloomy that he said another war would end civilization. The rejoinder can, of course, be made that if another war would end civilization anyhow, win, lose, or draw, the United States might as well disband its defense forces now and enjoy life for the few short years that remain. The Cold War. In some respects, the Cold War is not novel. It resembles the intercivilizational wars of the past, in which competing civilizations with definite moral and political foundations fought one another for final survival. This kind of warfare is very different indeed from struggles waged between nations which have a common civilization and which have a common interest in the preservation of that civilization. The Americans of the 1950s are waging a struggle much more like that between the Protestants and Catholics in the years 1618 to 48 than they are to the Civil War of 1861 to 65 or the Revolutionary War of 1775 to 81. In some respects, we Americans are back all the way to the fight between the Aztecs and Cortez, or the struggle between Chinese and Chams in ancient Annam. What Mr. Lippmann calls merely a Cold War is something deeper, bigger, and worse than any war Americans have ever known before. The only parallel to it was the struggle between settlers and Indians on our own frontier. Our battles with the Indians, at least, had the advantage of never leaving us with the hideous dread that the American Indians might sweep a white and Christian civilization from this continent. Nature of the Cold War. The Cold War is therefore a struggle, the beginnings of which can be found at any one of several dates, 1848, 1917, and 1943 are some of those given, which is now being waged between non-communist states and a communist group of nations. No one now living can speak with assurance of the outcome. Only the most foolhardy of optimists could visualize a world in which the better aspects of each system would be developed, and the factors common to each would be underscored and strengthened as supports for a peace-seeking international system under the UN. The struggle is larger than a war because it comprises pre-belligerent, belligerent, and post-belligerent activities, both in global wars and in a possible general war. On the communist side, the techniques include sabotage, revolution, conspiracy, and fanatical organization. On the anti-communist side, a family of paramilitary weapons is gradually being developed and may or may not be thrown into the struggle. No war was ever as bitter or uncertain as this one, because war, whatever its demerits, at least commits the nations to combat and to victory. War has the supreme merit of decision. The Cold War does not. People have to fight it without knowing what it is or what they would get out of it if they could obtain the advantage. Origins of the Cold War. In retrospect, it is easy to argue that the communist system has been fighting all non-communist systems ever since 1848, that the Soviet system has been in a moral condition of war with all other governments since 1917, that the Democratic Soviet alliance against the fascist powers during 1941 to 45 was a sham and a fraud covering a three-cornered war, and that therefore attempts at a good alliance between non-communists and communists were shams, mistakes, or frauds. This is easy to say in the 1950s. It was not so apparent in the 1940s. It can even be argued that Yalta, and everything for which Yalta stands, was a tragic mistake and yet a blessed one. If the Western powers had not attempted to deal amicably with the Soviet Union at Yalta, the Western peoples, already hypersensitized in matters of conscience, might have attributed to themselves and to their posterity an unbearable burden of guilt. We and our children might have gone down fighting while wondering in our innermost hearts, why didn't we make a real try to avoid war with Soviet Russia? Though the Tehran and Yalta agreements have been violated by the USSR almost from the moment they were concluded, it can be argued that the Western world was wise in experimenting with appeasement because it liberated our consciences for future struggle. No one can possibly argue that we did not try to get along with the communist system, that we failed to offer the communists a reasonable share in the world of power politics, or that we threatened the communists with aggression during the course of our anti-fascist struggle. For better or for worse, we did try to get along with them. We have failed. Why have we failed? The failure seems to be much more on the side of the communists than on the side of the free nations. Though it is possible for left liberals or hypercritical intellectuals to find fault with the U.S. and British position in this respect or that, short of extreme nitpicking, it must be argued that the communists jumped the gun on the Western powers in almost every case. Tito, while still in agreement with Moscow, proved implacable toward the constitutional Yugoslav government and the Church as they had existed before 1941. While Roosevelt was still living, the Lublin Poles prepared a savage double cross of the London Poles. Whether communist action arose from a lamentable fear of our own aggressiveness or a Machiavellian plan to conquer the world does not, at any time, matter very much. What matters is the almost indisputable fact that in many parts of the world, the communists undertook the initiative against the anti-communists. The first edition of this book, Psychological Warfare, was written in 1946 and published in 1948. The second edition is being completed 8 years later, in 1954. Any reader who contrasts the two editions will see at a glance that the author, although suspicious of communism, had no real anticipation of the fury or seriousness of the communist attack upon the non-communist world, nor of the strategic arguments and responsibilities which the free world would therewith be forced to accept. The Cold War and the actual fighting. As late as 1948, when the talented and bold-minded Lieutenant General Albert C. Wedemeyer was Deputy Chief of Staff, the U.S., Army psychological warfare facilities at the general staff level consisted of a few paper assignments to colonels in operations and in training, together with your author as a part-time consultant and one girl stenographer to keep the files. By 1953, these numbers were multiplied by the hundreds. Each of the military services has accepted its responsibility so that by 1953 there was not merely one Army psy-war system, but there were at least 5 separate organizations in the U.S. government, in different places, and at 5 levels, directly concerned with these problems. A curious division of responsibilities, not anticipated by the Creel Committee of World War I or the WWII of World War II, arose in the Washington of the Cold War period. While the military establishments were given jurisdiction over propaganda activities connected with actual combat, other propaganda activities were kept largely in civilian hands, though simultaneously the direction of civilian policy at its very highest level became paramilitary through the influence of the National Security Council. In other words, most of the national foreign policy decisions at the highest level have been dictated in recent years by strategic considerations. They have been National Security Council decisions, not cabinet-type decisions of the kind which might have been made in the years of William McKinley or Warren G. Harding. Yet, even though the decisions have been strategic in type, the propaganda implementation of these decisions has fallen for the greater part on the State Department and on the economic aid program facilities, not on the military. The military have been pretty strictly confined to those aspects of propaganda which directly pertain to combat areas. By 1953, U.S. leaders had begun to understand the situation with which they had been dealing since 1947, and in light of that necessarily belated but correct appreciation of their own position, the William Jackson Committee began to recommend that propaganda policy be written not as something self-contained, but be considered an integral part of every other U.S. government decision possessing world situation or news impact. The Cold War and the home front. Among editors, professors, officers, officials, and other experts concerned with foreign affairs, there has been frequent lamentation that the American people did not take the great struggle of our time more seriously. The contrary should be argued, at least by way of contrast. If it is true that the United States is engaged in a major struggle, if it is further true that this struggle has no visible end, if this struggle threatens all of us and our children as well with lifetimes of tension and violent deaths under ultra-destructive weapons, one may quite reasonably ask the question, which is the better reaction for the bulk of the American population? Normality, emotional health, mild irresponsibility, and the stockpiling of nervous and physical strength for a time of trial which may lie far ahead, or alternatively, tension now, worry now, responsibility now, fatigue now, all the way through from the uncertain present across the bitter and perilous future to the months of near Armageddon which may lie 15, 20, or 30 years ahead. Sadly and seriously, with no attempt at cleverness or mockery, a staff officer could argue today that the American people should leave their worries to their leaders so as to be strong when the time of trouble comes. In the field of civil defense, for instance, it is grotesque to spend billions on offense and little on the saving of American lives. On second glance, this may not be so grotesque after all. The technological advance of fissionable and thermonuclear weapons is so rapid, the development of guided missiles and other carrying instruments so swift and so unpredictable, that a 1955 model civil defense system might become a fool's paradise by 1960. If this be true, it is better to live as well as we can to maintain the profession of arms at an adequate level, to hope, quite irrationally, for the best, and to let the dead of the future bury their dead as best they may. Alternatives to victory and defeat. In a Cold War, as opposed to a war, the role of the armed services is to deter the enemy, not fight the enemy, and the purpose of the government is to achieve an accommodation, in the sense of an arrangement satisfactory to both sides, not a victory. If this is correct, serious reappraisal must be made of the U.S. psy-war position as well as of our strategic thinking. The alternatives to victory and defeat are forms of survival of the competitors. The entire health of each competing civilization matters. It is obvious enough to Americans that we must remain prosperous, free, constitutional, democratic. It goes without saying that we must, as far as our individual fortunes permit us, retain our belief in God and derive from religious beliefs those spiritual strengths not available to the communists. What is not often raised is the equally important factor of the conquest of probability. Wars are much more often won by people who are sure they are going to win than by people who know that they would like to win, but who think at the same time that they will probably be defeated. The overconfidence of a Cortez or a Mao Zedong may seem insane to many of us. With the passion for security so prevalent in individual and national lives, both the Western powers and the individuals comprising them grotesquely exaggerate the margin of safety which they need in which to survive. Part of this springs from the fact that much of our civilization is not forward-looking, that neither young Americans nor old Americans have a clear-cut or hopeful picture of what the world should be, will be, and must be by AD 2055. On the communist side, it is frequent, but not universal, to discover that the best communist cadres are made up of men who are dead sure that communism will win, who are equally sure that communism does not have to be right in order to win, and who are sure that objectively and scientifically, whatever that may mean, the communist system is almost certainly destined to succeed. If communism cannot get out of succeeding, the responsibility of the individual communist becomes bearable. He is still seriously and tragically responsible for the expediting or the delaying of the inevitable, but he does not take the mantle of God or Karl Marx and state that this is the world as he wishes it to be, and that the world of his desires will come into existence if, and only if, he fulfills his personal responsibilities to the utmost. In Asia, perhaps more than in Europe, there are many persons who are turning toward communism, not because they think it is good or just, or even because it is powerful, but simply because it is likely. Every individual in his own life has known that he cannot undo the passage of time, the aging of his body, the death of his loved ones, the loss of opportunities which might have been seized, or even his own death. In their individual lives, men of all nations perform the feat, characteristic of the human being, and apparently shared by no other species of life, of living from day to day in a constant reconciliation of the past and present with their own estimate of the probable future. At times in history, that which should happen seems to be unleashed like spiritual lightning, and men rally in frenzy around causes which for the year or the decade seem inspiring, terrifyingly beautiful, and within human reach. Through most of history, that which is apt to occur provides a more sober guide to the future, and men prepare to live in accordance with its standards. In the battle of the probabilities, the psy-war of the Western powers has been weak, high-pitched, and uncertain, while the insistence of the communist themes has been as monotonous and hypnotic as a jungle drum. For better or for worse, the communists have broken a path through to what they think to be the future. We of other nations have not. The chief element of anti-communist victory, practical, sober expectation of a certain and final downfall of the Soviet system, has thus far been lacking on the anti-communist side. The communists, on the contrary, have unreasonably, provocatively, and untruthfully raved, screamed, shrieked, and lied to bring about that better world which, curiously enough, their most effective cadres considered to be an inevitable world. Thus the UN prisoners held by the communists during the Korean War were subjected to a constant bombardment of communist propaganda concerning their personal responsibilities before history and the opportunities which they would have to serve peace and mankind, as these noble concepts are set forth on the red side. The end of the Cold War. If the hypothesis set forth above, namely, that the Cold War may turn out to be unendable war, except in terms which no living man can visualize, it may be true that appreciation of the role of psychological warfare, whatever it may later be called, in this struggle, may have to wait a few more years. One factor often overlooked on the American side has been the limitation of the originators. Propaganda, to be effective among foreign peoples or foreign armies, cannot and should not outrun the strategic capabilities or the political intentions of the issuing power. It does no good for an American propaganda radio to pledge battle to the death while the U.S. press services amiably discuss an accommodation with the communists. Comparably, an official propaganda plan to make the people of France feel that the Americans love and admire them is not very realistic if, in terms of column inches of French press material, unofficial American utterances are related to France to the effect that the French are washed up, their cause in Indochina hopeless, their economy unviable, and their political goals foolish. The years 1950 to 54, during which the Korea struggle took place, and in which NATO and the European Defense Community, EDC, came to prominence, often showed a proclivity on the part of U.S. official propagandists to go far beyond that which their home public would support. Need it be said that the effects on foreign public opinion were possibly deflationary? An imaginable end to the Cold War may lie in neither victory nor defeat, in neither accommodation nor reconciliation, but in the development of more, newer, and different quarrels. Hostility of Protestant and Catholic faded out in Europe when the hostility of French, Germans, Spaniards, and other nationalities came to be more important. It is a problem for the psychiatrist and sociologist to answer if they can. Is it possible that semantics of war-causing quarrels can be superseded by anything other than different quarrels? A tension-free civilization is imaginable. Given the characteristics of most present-day cultures, it is scarcely more than merely imaginable. If within the limits of practical possibility one were to list the hypothetical requirements for an end of the Cold War, the following might stand forth. 1. General war leading to destruction of either the communist or non-communist systems. Or 2. Prolongation of the present Cold War atmosphere until new and more interesting quarrels arise which make the present ones obsolete. Or 3. Reconciliation of the communist and anti-communist systems by some process not now imaginable along the general lines of Franklin D. Roosevelt's grand design. Or 4. Collapse of all major civilizations under impact of fissionable and thermonuclear weapons. Or 5. Gradual erosion of the anti-communist world and an eventual communist victory by sustained communist successes short of war. Or the alternative of gradual erosion of the communist world and the creation of a constitutionalist and libertarian probability of victory, also without the outbreak of general war. It would be a brave and foolish man who would say which of these the world should expect, but it would be a stupid staff officer who did not anticipate at least one of them, and who did not as a military officer or government official do his best to bring about victory in a form which his side could define, recognize, welcome, and achieve. The 7 Small Wars. The foregoing extensive discussion of the Cold War has been included because it explains a great deal of the apparent contradictoriness, irresoluteness, and uncertainty of the small wars which have occurred since the end of World War II. The 7 small wars fall into a threefold pattern. If China is excluded, China is taken up in the next section. This is the first pattern. 5 of the 7 wars were Asian struggles against the Western powers. Korea, Indochina, the Philippines, in which communist Filipinos regard the United States as their ultimate enemy, Malaya, and Indonesia. In Korea and Indochina, the struggle came to be communist-controlled. In Indonesia, the struggle ended in a nationalist victory. In the Philippines, the struggle degenerated into petty skirmishes between a native constitutional government and communist extremists. One war was an expression of European nationalism on the soil of Asia with the creation of the new state of Israel. The third category is, of course, the special case presented by the Indian-Pakistani fighting, which is a struggle between Asian nationalisms without much intervention from either European colonialism or communism. The most important of these wars were the 5 in Korea, Indochina, the Philippines, Malaya, and Indonesia. The Israeli struggle appears pretty well settled as a fighting war, and the India-Pakistan issue appears not to be one which will lead to general war between those two countries. The predominant group of wars shows variations of the same components in different quantities. Each was a reaction to the fall of Japan's short-lived East Asia military empire. Each involved partial or complete resistance to economic affiliation with the capitalist world. Each had an ingredient, though these differed in stress and direction, of local Asian nationalism. Except for Indonesia, each eventually became a part of the worldwide front between communism and anti-communism. These wars deserve consideration one at a time for their psy-war content. The special case of China. None of the wars mentioned above was as bloody or as tragic as the Chinese Civil War between communists and nationalists, which ended with a Red victory in 1949. The China situation is too complicated to be summed up in a single paragraph. The political, economic, and propaganda components on each side of that war are as yet not completely assessed. For instance, one of the major factors in the defeat of the nationalists consisted of the withdrawal of the Japanese managers and technicians from China, as well as of those Japanese troops who had been maintaining a degree of law and order in Manchuria and North China. This withdrawal was not only sought by such progressives in the State Department as John Stuart Service and Alger Hiss, it was also enthusiastically endorsed by conservatives such as General Wedemeyer, who shipped the Japanese out, and General MacArthur, who received them. No American, right-wing or left-wing, seriously proposed replacing the Japanese with United States or United Nations personnel until the nationalists had enough trainees to manage a modern capitalist China. By withdrawing the Japanese, the nationalists and the Allies destroyed the political and economic system under which the nationalists proposed to operate, and were then astonished when the nationalists met defeat. In the China policy situation, the contribution of communist covert propaganda within the United States in preventing aid to Chiang in the crucial years of 1947, 1948, and 1949 should not be overlooked. Neither should it be overestimated, nor considered the sole determinant of events which took place within China. Psy-war in the Indonesian-Dutch War. A rapid and talented command of propaganda was shown by the Indonesians in their retention of power in the face of a Dutch landing in the islands in 1945-46. The Indonesians were readily alert to the necessity for obtaining U.S., British, Australian, and other foreign sympathizers. They opened propaganda offices abroad and did an excellent job of presenting their own case. While Indonesian combat propaganda against the Netherlands troops is not recorded as having had much effect on Dutch morale, their use of global strategic propaganda to support a local war was excellent. Netherlands ships were refused docking and loading services by Australian stevedores. American press and public sympathy ran very largely in the Indonesian favor. Indonesian acceptance of the political concept, United States of Indonesia, which was dropped as soon as independence was won, may have played a significant role in winning American sympathy. Dutch military and strategic propaganda in their war with the Indonesians suffered from uncertainty on the Dutch side as to the goals of the war. The suspicion that a Netherlands victory would be nothing more than a triumph of colonial capitalism and the insistent interference of United Nations and United States observers. The Dutch were never able to put across the point that Indonesia derived its nationhood from imperial Japanese sponsorship, and the Netherlands' withdrawal was dictated as much by the practical necessity of reconciling world opinion and balancing the home budget as by the militarily untenable nature of the Dutch enterprise. The Philippine War against the Hooks. By contrast, the Republic of the Philippines faced a very serious military situation in the challenge of the Huk Army's tough communist troops concentrated in central Luzon, who waged a cruel and bitter war, rather like the struggle of the Irish Republicans against the Black and Tans. By 1950, the Philippine government was in a serious position. There was at least the remote possibility that if the government continued to falter, the city of Manila might have fallen to a communist coup. In this situation, Ramon Magsaysay, as Secretary of Defense, developed some of the most provocative and audacious anti-guerrilla operations of the post-war period. To meet the communist claim that the struggle was one of the landless against the rich, he offered all surrendered Huks resettlement in a new land project. He visited the project himself frequently enough to make sure it remained a valuable demonstration area. To allow the common people to help the government, without their suffering from communist reprisals against themselves or their families, he disseminated secret methods whereby the people could communicate with the government forces. He established a psychological warfare office under Major Jose Crisol. This office was doing as good a job of tactical psy-war, with leaflets, mimeographs, loudspeakers, light planes, and other field and headquarters equipment as any army installation which the author has seen. Most of the doctrine and procedures for the operation of the office were American, but the content of the materials was Filipino. Catholicism, Filipino patriotism, Malayan nativism, and peasant common sense were some of the factors used to underscore the Philippine Army's appeals. In the following 3 years, the Huks shrank seriously, although the danger could not be said to have been eliminated altogether. Indochina and political warfare. With devotion, often with heroism, frequently with brilliance, the French military forces in Indochina fought a communist-captured nationalist movement known as the Viet Minh. They fought despite the accompaniments of a wretched and vacillating home policy, incredibly poor psychological relationships with the native elite, and security situations which pass all American belief. One Vietnamese recently told the author that the pro-communist Viet Minh soldiers fought as long as they could against the French, and then came back to French territory to eat good food, visit their families, rest and relax before returning to the field to murder more French sentries, blow up more French patrols, or attack more French outposts. It ill becomes an American to criticize the French for their policy in Indochina, since it was by virtue of a U.S. strategic decision and a U.S. logistical action that Indochina was turned first from Japanese hands into the hands of the British in the south and the Chinese nationalists in the north. The British did not care much about the local situation. The particular Chinese nationalists in northern Indochina were mildly sympathetic with local nationalism, but chiefly preoccupied with stealing everything that could be put on a truck. After this ill-fated liberation, the Americans then assisted the French in transporting forces back to Indochina. This was after much of the U.S. press and many U.S. leaders had indicated their disapproval of French colonialism and had given indirect but powerful encouragement to Viet Minh's rebellion against the French. Having helped foul up the situation for the French hopelessly, the United States then observed their return, a return which was definitely, though indirectly, made possible only by U.S. aid to France, with uncertainty and disquiet. It took the Americans 4 years to decide that they were on the French side, and even then they were not very much on the French side. Neither were the French. The French side was an indefinable amalgam of old-fashioned French colonialism, the membership of 3 small Asian states in a French union, and anti-communism. The French made the mistake, which the Americans repeated when they invited the Chinese Communist general, Wang Xuan, to New York to defame the United States through the courtesy of the United States government, or when they tried dealing with the Chinese Communists, fighting them, dealing with them, and fighting with them again. When the French finally decided to seek an all-out military victory against the Communists, they set up local governments which they themselves promptly dishonored, giving them neither prestige nor authority enough to combat the communist menace in local Asian terms. That the French should have held the Asian anti-communist front under these strange political circumstances is a credit to France. The Indo-Chinese War has been dirty, discouraging. It has often verged upon the hopeless. The French have been criticized by the Americans in the early period of the reoccupation of Indochina for not turning the country over to communist nationalists, lock, stock, and barrel. Later, the Americans criticized the French because the French did not annihilate the same communist nationalists, whom the Americans had previously lauded. In the end, Dien Bien Phu and Geneva were the inevitable concomitants of Panmunjom. Once we made peace, the French had to make an equally bad peace, too. The United States was adroit enough to obtain the immense psychological leverage of getting the Korean War recognized as a UN war. The Indo-Chinese War was not made a UN war, even though it was the same enemy who was being fought, Asian communists underwritten by Peking and guaranteed by Moscow in each case. Amazing though it may seem, practical psychological warfare was almost completely neglected by the French until the Americans supplied the French with printing facilities for French Annamite leaflets in 1950. By 1952, the French had assigned staff officers to carry out psychological warfare responsibilities, and were making a serious effort to link up with the other anti-communist forces in East Asia for the purpose of obtaining psychological warfare know-how. A considerable improvement in tactical psychological warfare was made between 1950 and 1952. The strategic psychological warfare position of the French in the area must be referred back to the Battle of the Probabilities mentioned earlier in this chapter. So long as French, Americans, and Annamites all feel that a French defeat is quite probable and say so both publicly and privately, it will be difficult for the French to make the Indochinese believe that Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos are here to stay as French-protected and anti-communist nations. Malaya and the MRLA. The MRLA, or Malayan Races Liberation Army, is a Chinese communist guerrilla army operating in the jungles of Malaya. Malaya, minus the island of Singapore, which is a separate crown colony to itself, has been constituted in the post-war period as a federation of Malay sultanates. The British have talked a great deal about the self-government of Malaya, the eventual end of their own rule, and the progress of the people. Everything, or almost everything, which the British say is true, except for the fundamental fact that the Chinese in Malaya can, under British rule, enjoy anything except life, purpose, and honor. What are life, purpose, and honor in basic human terms? They are the rights to belong to something, to be a part of history, to make one's own world move, to be a human being superior to other human beings, to be vain, to be proud, to be self-sacrificing. After years of war against the Chinese communist guerrillas, who have small components of Malayans and Indians with them, the British have not yet found a single British brigadier or major general of the Chinese race. The world at large on the anti-communist side has yet to hear of a Chinese Malayan hero who served mankind by falling martyr to the communist terror or by emerging as victor in valiant, heroic combat. The Chinese in Malaya, as the author has observed at first hand, are probably more prosperous than any other Chinese have ever been anywhere in the world. Under capitalism today, the Chinese communities in Malaya have achieved a degree of wealth, health, and education which communist China will be remarkable to have achieved if it survives and succeeds for the next 100 years. Does this not give the lie to the great communist myth concerning Asia, the myth accepted by many Western politicians, intellectuals, and newspaper men, that the struggle between communism and anti-communism is a struggle for living standards? That the issue is an issue of who will provide the best livelihood? On the pro-communist side in Malaya, Chinese who are not religious and who are known for their practicality and secularism struggle for the chance to go forth and suffer, to serve in an army with bad medical service and no pensions, to face an almost certain death in the jungle, to lose life and property, which they could keep on the British side, in order to gain that other kind of life with honor and purpose on the communist side. The British meanwhile progress, no doubt. In many respects, the British administrations in Singapore and Malaya are more enlightened than some of the local governments in the United States. But whatever the reason, they do not seem to belong to the Chinese who live there, or even to the Malays. They are governments for the people, and not, so far as the local people seem to judge, governments of the people. Is it reasonable to ask in the mid-1950s that decent British officers and civil servants convert themselves into apocalyptic fanatics of a weird composite Asian nationalism? Can the British make revolution in Malaya when they are rather fatigued with their own labor revolution at home? Can we Americans, who have made nothing, absolutely nothing, out of the heroism and romance and tradition that might have been reconstituted as the ancient kingdom of Ryukyu-Okinawa, be in a position to chide the British for not doing that which we ourselves do not undertake? The communist magic is strong, bad magic. In North Korea, it created officers in an unreasonably short time, developed fanatics while we were trying to develop gentlemen, and came close to defeating us in the perilous weeks of the Pusan perimeter. In China, soldiers of whom many Americans despaired when they fought on the nationalist side became desperate assault infantry under communist training. The timid and quarrelsome Annamites who had given the French so little trouble before communism organized them fought like leopards once they read Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong, and Ho Chi Minh. Was this why the communists were able to continue in Malaya? no one has ever accused the British Army of a lack of ingenuity. The forces who developed desert raiders, coastal commandos, airdropped banditti, and a plethora of amusing, shocking, and audacious innovations cannot be accused of a lack of imagination. The British did use psychological warfare in Malaya strategically, tactically, in the field, in the cities, by radio, and by print. When Carleton Greene was directing the British psy-war effort from the headquarters of that redoubtable gentleman, Malcolm MacDonald, British Commissioner General for Southeast Asia, he even resorted to the device of writing individual letters to known communists and leaving these letters scattered through the jungle. The British used white propaganda, black propaganda, gray propaganda. If there had been a purple propaganda, they certainly would have tried it. Alex Josie came close to it when he shocked the planters in Malaya by delivering socialist speeches over the Malay radio in an attempt to pull the left wing off the communist bird. Sir Henry Gurney, the High Commissioner of the Federation who was murdered in 1952, was a veteran of irregular warfare. He had faced the Zionist terrorists in Jerusalem and was a man without fear. His approach to the problem of confronting communism was hopelessly sane. The communists were offering young Chinese the intoxication of craziness, of a mad and heroic righteousness to justify the misspending of their lives. Sir Henry's answer was decency, goodness, security, prosperity, authority, liberty under law. He offered everything except glamour, terror, inspiration, and romance. Everything except the chance to join the British side. What kind of British side? A British side which, like the communist side, would welcome the makers of the future, the builders of the next civilization, the arbiters of history. The communists have presented a high bid against the US and Britain as well as the other Western powers. We have not yet overbid them. The high bid is the opportunity to join, to belong, really to be equal, not just legally equal, and above everything to share, to struggle, and to work under conditions of heroism for a common goal. The right to join. The West has lost a lot of the Cold War in Asia because the communist side could be joined and the Western side could not be joined. There is no American party in India, but there is a communist party. There is no anti-communist army to which cadres of men from either Soviet-occupied or Soviet-free territories can be made welcome. There is no command point for the anti-communist struggle. There is the promise of immense U.S. help, even the promise of British, Colombian, Ethiopian, and other help for Korea or other Koreas. Is there much willingness to be helped? Is there any way that we can let ordinary Asians in on our side? The top levels of this problem are, of course, political. They must be solved in the light of a U.S. home public which eschews crusades and dreads adventures. At a lower level, the problem becomes one for the military staffs of the future. How can the United States, the United Nations, or other anti-communist forces recruit native leaders and native followers under circumstances of dignity and honor? How can we either learn to love the allies we have or to find allies whom we can love? Until then, much of the spiritual and organizational advantage in Asia will fall to the communists. We may have the better ideals, but if people who are determined to illuminate their own lives with the splendor of risky, heroic, or self-sacrificing action, and who insist on doing something desperate somewhere somehow, so as to relieve the ignominy, poverty, and monotony of their existences, cannot learn how to join us, they will perforce join the other side. A slight or even a substantial increase in economic welfare in the Asian states seems to the author to favor a sharp increase in communist strength. When people are desperately poor or sick, they cannot worry about causes. When they become moderately well enough off to know that they are despised, poor by our standards, ignorant by our standards, then the point of psychological frenzy comes in. Propaganda techniques in the 7 wars. Neither in the Chinese Civil War nor in the 7 other wars listed has there been much refinement of propaganda techniques over World War II. As a matter of fact, it took the Korean War 2 years to come up to the standards of Normandy. It is amazing how many propaganda techniques had become lost arts between 1945 and 1950. The author himself flew under the Chinese Communist forces along the Han River in March 1951, when the voice plane in which he rode as an observer had to hug the valley bottoms in order to get its message to the Chinese ground forces past the sound of its own propellers. Instead of ingenious, up-to-the-minute gadgets to dispense leaflets, the author joined the young officers in the plane in throwing the leaflets out of the plane door by hand. He thought ruefully about the leaflet bombs and leaflet dispensers which had been used in Europe and in Burma, and when he returned unharmed to Daegu, he submitted one more red-hot memorandum recommending the obvious. The strategic psy-war self-limitations imposed by the United States on the United States in the Korean War were also crippling. The United States did not desire anything which a professional soldier would recognize as victory. U.S. opinion was divided as to whether all of Korea should be liberated by UN forces. At the policy-making level, certainly among our allies, there was pretty general agreement to remain at peace with the supply dumps and high command of the Chinese Communist forces in Manchuria and China while fighting the forward echelons of those forces in Korea. The United States would not accept defeat, nor would it seek a decisive victory, because victory might have involved the risk of war. Under these conditions, it must be pointed out that General MacArthur had the first and only psy-war establishment ready to operate the moment the Korean War began. Colonel J. Woodall Green ably managed the Tokyo headquarters for most of the period of the Korean War. The Department of the Army showed great good judgment in bringing back Brigadier General Robert McClure, who had been Eisenhower's psy-war chief in Europe, to the new Department of the Army's psy-war establishment, which was created on the 15th of January 1951, in the Pentagon as a part of Special Staff, United States Army, with the title of Office of the Chief of Psychological Warfare, OCPW. When General McClure departed for Tehran, he was succeeded at OCPW by Brigadier General William Bullock. The last period of the Korean War found Korean local psy-war at the headquarters of 8th U.S. Army in Korea, EUSAC, under the command of Colonel Donald Hall, who had probably seen more continuous psy-war service than any other officer in the U.S. Army.
This concludes today's reading of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.